Hello, so in this lecture we're going to talk about some of the legal issues that are faced by internet scale applications. So I'm not any kind of legal expert, but I think it's worth touching on a few of the things that you need to think about if you're running this kind of thing. And as I said, this intersects with the privacy issues and with the security issues. So what sort of legal issues could we encounter? Well, sensitive customer data could be stolen from the cloud provider. Customers could upload illegal content. Maybe the customers use your credentials to hack the cloud provider, steal its services, this kind of stuff. Or the cloud provider shares your data with the customer, with the government. And before these things all do happen, they happen all the time, it's going to happen to you. So it's better to be clear about where the legal liability is before these events actually happen. Now, a lot of legal issues relate to personal data. And the UK Information Commissioner's Office gives quite a large number of criteria for personal data. So it's very important to understand what personal data is, and so you can identify which of the data that you're storing is personal data and which is not. And then there'll be certain very, quite severe legal consequences to if bad stuff happens to the personal data, but the other data is much less important or sensitive. So these are its criteria for personal data, such as can a living individual be identified by the data? Does the data provide information about the individual? Could it be used to inform actions about an individual? Does the data concentrate on the individual as a central theme? Does it have the potential to impact an individual in personal, family, business, or professional capacity? So there's a long list of rather tedious and slightly similar descriptions of personal data. And if you're storing data about a customer, it's well worth knowing whether it fits into this definition of personal data or not. Because if you lose personal data, people can have their identity stolen, they're losing their privacy, and there can be an impact on family, business, and so on. So there'll be 37 million personal records stolen from the online cheating site Ashley Madison, for example. 45.7 million credit debit card numbers stolen from TJX, maybe with the associated data. So this is a classic personal data sort of loss, right? Ashley Madison's a cheating website where if you're a little bit tired of your husband or wife, you sign up here and hook up with someone else online, who's also cheating on their husband or wife. And obviously having all this stuff stolen, and then the people who stole it, they sort of threatened to make it all public and maybe even did so as some kind of moral stance against people who cheat. So if this is obviously personal data, and the loss of it has obviously impacted people in their personal lives and possibly in their business lives as well. And there's lots of costs. So having data stolen is bad, but it's bad in lots of different ways. So you've got to notify the people whose data was stolen, something Ashley Madison, TJX had to do, no doubt. Potentially you have to assist the affected individuals. You have to compensate them for the harm and associated distress. Obviously, Ashley Madison's lost a lot of customers and reputation as a result of this breach. If you've had all this data deleted, then you're going to have to restore it somehow. And the Information Commissioner's Office can impose penalties for loss of personal data up to £500,000. It's quite a lot of money for some companies. I think police got fined, for losing personal data in various kinds of ways. So, there's real severe penalties potentially if you manage to lose personal data, or have it stolen from you in a casual way, in a careless way. So we talk about cloud storage. Cloud storage is constantly on the increase at the moment because of its convenience. But with cloud services, you don't have full control over the data that you've got stored there. You've got this uneasy mix between the cloud provider having some responsibilities and you having some of the data management responsibilities. And at least from the research that I've done, it seems that the legal situation with that is still unclear. There's a few things you can do, but it's all a bit tricky and vague and ambiguous. So one thing that you can look for when you're picking a cloud provider is this ISO 27000 certificate. And that specifies how an information security management system should be built, like the requirements for it, which is a systematic way in which sensitive company information can be managed so that it remains secure. So Amazon has one of these. So it's if they conform to the requirements of this certificate, then that gives you some confidence that they're putting some effort into managing this sensitive data in an appropriate way. And many of these legal issues are handled through a contract with the service provider. So if you're storing data with S3, it'll specify who owns the data, how the cloud provider will respond to a subpoena. So if the government or the court or whatever wants to access some of that data, what will the cloud provider do? How are they backing up the data? What's their level of service? Is there any kind of insurance that will protect against bad stuff if stuff does happen? And what kind of international standards apply to their management of the data? I've already talked about the certificate as well, which might be covered in that. If you're a small company, which most people are, relative to Amazon that is, then you're stuck with the default contract. You've got no choice over it. You can't negotiate it. The best you can do is shop around and find a different cloud provider if you find that the terms and conditions are not acceptable for your company. So yeah, shop around, or if you're very big, then you can potentially negotiate a special contract. But you have to be very big. But then there's lots of tricky stuff can happen with cloud providers from a legal point of view. So they often have the right to unilaterally terminate service provision. So Amazon could say, next week, well, sorry guys, we've decided you're going to sell all the computers and give up, hosting web services. And they could just do that, and you'd have no recourse, and you wouldn't even necessarily be able to get your data. Or more likely scenario is, you're with a smaller cloud provider, and they go bust, right? So they go bust. Means the internet service provider that they use shut down. You can no longer reach their servers, and maybe they sell those servers, and you've no control of what happens to whether the servers are properly wiped before being sold, and all the rest of it. And if something goes badly wrong with a cloud provider, typically all you get is credits. So let's suppose Amazon Web Services went down for a week. You lost half your customers. They might say, well, sorry guys, it's only 99.9% judged over a period of 1,000 years or something. Sorry about the week, but here you are. You can have a week's extra credits or some $30 worth of free storage or something like that. So that's a typical response. You don't get compensation for the loss of customers, loss of reputation, or any of that. You just get some more service credits. And then the other issue with cloud providers is, are they actually using your data in any way? If I'm storing my data with them, are they then mining that and potentially using the data to, contact my customers or find, sensitive information about my customers? Another legal issue with cloud providers is who's responsible for illegal content. So if my customers use my website and to upload ripped films, let's say, to Amazon, who's responsible? Well, in the EU, this is pretty clear, right? The EU has protection for hosting providers. So if I host a website, if I provide hosting services or cloud storage services or something, then I don't have any liability if I don't know about that data. So if I have no knowledge about the film or whatever that's been uploaded to my website or uploaded to Amazon's cloud storage or whatever, then I'm not personally liable as a cloud provider or as a web hoster. However, if the illegal content is discovered and I'm told about it, then I have an obligation to delete it from my system. However, in other countries, the cloud providers can be held responsible for the illegal data that they may be hosting. So in the EU, you're probably okay, but you're not okay. If you need to be, how this is monitored and enforced, I've no idea, but in other countries, you can be held accountable. And governments, want to get their hands on customer data, either from cloud providers or from the internet service providers. So they can often, request data from cloud providers, probably without your permission, or they can get it from the internet service provider. And so there's, snooping charter or whatever, and the Patriot Act and the Investigative Power Bill and all this kind of stuff. So often the government can, look at your data without your permission, probably. Now, something to be very aware of when you're building an internet scale application is the laws on transfer of data abroad. Again, this is typically personal data, and that's why the criteria for personal data are so important. So the EU Directive on Data Protection prohibits transfer of personal data to non-EU countries that do not meet the EU standard for privacy protection. So basically, the idea is that data that's held within the EU that contains personal information about EU citizens or anyone within the EU can't be transferred to another country where they might potentially use that data in a way, for all kinds of unpleasant, bad, unpalatable, ends kind of thing. So you can transfer data outside the EU, personal data outside the EU, if it's going to a place that has data protection laws, or it's going to the US. And it's an interesting distinction here. So acceptable law means it's got similar data protection standards to the EU. So let's suppose Japan has great data protection, ensures the privacy of its citizens in the same way as the EU, then I could transfer my data to servers in Japan. Or you can also transfer the data to the US. So the US has this, we've got the safe harbor agreement. I'll talk about it now. So the US and EU have this safe harbor agreement. Now, I don't think, as far as I can tell, the USA does not have particularly good privacy laws. You've got the National Security Agency snooping on all its citizens' data and all the rest of it, as revealed by all these leaks. But there is a fig leaf that enables data to be shared between the EU and the USA. So they've got this safe harbor agreement, which means you can transfer personal data from the EU and host it on the US. But in practice, that doesn't really mean much because the US isn't particularly secure or private or anything like that. So in general, transfers between EU countries are okay. Transfer from EU to non-EU countries generally not okay. So laws and data protection laws in Australia and Hong Kong are not deemed adequate. So if I moved data from a bucket stored in Ireland, personal data this is, from a bucket stored in Ireland to a bucket stored in Sydney, then that would be illegal under the EU laws. And as I said, there's serious problems with the safe harbor scheme. But there aren't really legal problems. It's more, bigger questions. It's perfectly legal to move your data, personal data from the EU to Illinois, let's say. And there's other tricky issues because you've got all these EU protection laws, but then some companies won't tell you where your data is stored. They say, for security reasons, we're not going to tell you which country your data is stored in, whatever that means. So then you can't really tell whether, if I use Google's cloud services, I can't tell whether I'm breaking the law or not because I don't know where the data is being stored. And Google apparently is guilty of this. And then there's problems. So suppose my customer's data is accessed by a foreign government. So I've got a Chinese dissident living in the US, and it turns out his data is all stored in Burma, and his data is compromised there. And then so he gets extradited, and bad stuff happens to him because the data was stored in a country that didn't have adequate data protection laws. And that'd be kind of a bit of a mess, particularly if it involved Europe. All right, some other issues. So I said, if you're using cloud data storage, you're stuck with a default contract, and the cloud storage provider can go bust, or they can terminate the service. They can share it's difficult to switch provider because if you've got a lot of data there, then you've got to download it all to your servers and then reload it, upload it to a different server. You probably have different data formats, all the rest of it. If they go bust, you won't necessarily have access to the data. So you need to be very aware that cloud data storage is fantastic. We're teaching it in this course, but it's also problematic from a legal point of view and potentially from a privacy point of view. So some checklists. I think there's probably a more detailed list of this in the links on the course website. So this is the sort of stuff you can look at. You can look at the security standards, location of data, liability, mention where the subcontractors, because it's another issue you can have. That you're storing your data with a cloud provider, then they're using another company, and that company could go bust or have different terms and conditions. It just gets all very murky. How do you get access to your data if you want to change provider? What happens if they go bust or you get into dispute with them? And the provider's safe harbor provisions. And then all you can do if you're going to use the cloud to store data, which is probably a good idea, is do your best to get an answers to some of these questions, write up a risk assessment, look at the kind of data you're going to store, and do your best to make it secure within that provider, and probably back it up somewhere else as well. Okay. So in this lecture, we looked at the legal issues applying to internet scale applications. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at cryptography, hash functions, digital signatures, and then explain how they work in peer-to-peer networks. And later on, next term, look at how they're used in cryptocurrencies.